Hi, I'm Huyen Tue Dao. I am an Android developer at Trello. Sorry, I just celebrated my 5-year anniversary at Trello like 2 days ago or yesterday. So I'm going on brand. So I want to talk to y'all about one of my favorite things in Android, constraint layout. You could probably say that I'm a constraint layout super fan, huge fan girl. And the idea for this talk came very directly from my team. And one of my absolute favorite coworkers ever said to me one day, I really don't think I'm using constraint layout right. And I think I had this weird reaction because I'm such a fangirl. When someone says they don't like your favorite band, you're just like, and when I thought about it though, I could understand why they thought that way. If you kind of just look at the constraint layout, like documentation, there's just a lot in it, and can I maximize the screen share? Oh, not me. Sorry. There's a lot in it. And I think why, my awesome teammate felt this way is for a couple reasons. Number one, there's just so much functionality that it can be really hard to feel like you have a handle on all of it. I mean, I know I don't. And there's so many very specialized things and very situational things that it might feel like if you're not using all the things, you're not using constraint layout effectively. And second, I always have this layout, with layout and with a lot of things, there's about a billion ways to do the same thing. And maybe at least half of them can be considered right. And same thing with constraint layout, especially with all of the functionality, it can feel like, well, there's a billion ways of doing this. And I'm going to do it, say, the simple way or the way that most reflects how I would use a linear layout or a frame layout, but that doesn't feel constraint layouty. I'm going to tell you right now that in my personal opinion, that if you're using constraint layout and barring any hacky or kludgy things, if your layout does what you want it to do in all the situations in which you need it to do that thing, it's right. And rather than focus on whether you're using all the things, and if you are feeling overwhelmed, like some people might be with constraint layout, what I'd like to do in this talk is to build a toolbox. And I think one of the things that help you clarify both conundrums that you have both in a particular layout or with constraint layout itself is to just build a basic toolbox. Just pick, a smaller subset of the features, kind of use them as, which, and these features are going to be things that in my opinion, will cover 80 to 90% of your day-to-day constraint layout life. And just get comfortable with those. And, if you have a really esoteric, weird, layout thing that you want to do, and you find yourself reaching out to kind of some of those other things, that's great. But never feel bad or feel that you have to do fancy things to do constraint layout right. It's more about making it work for you, which is kind of its whole job. And so I want to build a toolbox, kind of starting out with some super basic stuff and adding in a couple more not so basic things, but that again, I think will cover, most of, I know what I do with constraint layout most days. And we'll just go from there. But again, I always feel like with layout, and especially with constraint layout, start simple. If things don't work, add in something a little more, complex. And if that doesn't work out, add something a little bit more. But once you get it and it's good, then you stop. And that's kind of just how to approach it. So I have a toolbox here. It's actually a text file, it's not a toolbox. But as I go through an example layout I have with you and talk about kind of things that, some things are going to be really kind of highfalutin and kind of conceptual, and things will be very, very particular tips. I'm going to throw them in here as things that I kind of just lean on constantly in constraint layout. And hopefully at the end of this talk, we will have built kind of a toolbox that will get you most of the way through your constraint layout day. So let's go to Android Studio and open up this layout. So let's pretend that I'm writing an app that allows me to, I don't know, look at movies. And I have a kind of movie detail screen here. And okay, it's all constraint layout. So let's kind of dive in and see what we have here and what kind of tools we can pull out of there. So constraint layout, I'm going to assume that you have some familiarity with it just for brevity. But, if we look at kind of the bare essentials here, hopefully if you've kind of played around with constraint layout a little bit, these all look familiar to you. Kind of, again, the point of constraint layout is to position and size things relative to other views. And so the first view format look very familiar. Align this view to the top of this thing, to the bottom of that thing, to the start of this thing, kind of et cetera, and so forth. And following, okay, of the text box, of the, that better? Of the text? Yeah, that seems better. That's that. Okay. let me know if I need to increase it anymore. So, okay, so we have like the positioning. Those are all the constrained things. And then we have the sizing. So we have match parent, wrap content, and then of course specific dimensions like specific DP, SPPX, and then dimensions. But an important thing about building a toolkit is to know when not to use things or when things aren't even in the toolbox. And match parent absolutely is not in and should not be in your constraint layout toolbox. I am the annoying person on my team that on PRs is going to be like, oh, you shouldn't use match parent. And there's a really good reason for that. There's several good reasons. If you look in the documentation, it very specifically says do not use match parent. It might work sometimes, but increasingly, and especially I think in the last few releases, it will just break. Now in this layout, I do have a view that is match parent, the movie title here, and it works just fine. Looks how we expect it to look. But if I say take my director name here, and right now this director name is aligned to kind of like, you know, see here, like to the start edge of the movie title and then to this year. If I, even though match parent works in the view above it, if I change the director name to match parent, you can see it basically just kind of it goes ham. It ignores all the constraints. Match parent is not a supported dimension or dimension specification in constraint layout. And, you know, you probably are screaming at me, or if you've used constraint layout before, that of course you should use 0DP. Now, this is not like the interesting thing. I think what we should take away is not that 0DP is the new match parent, but to think of 0DP as what it's kind of referred to inside of constraint layout, the class, as match constraint. And match constraint is not just, you know, fill parent or match parent. It is really saying, hey, you know, like, you know, dimension of view that is set to match constraint, please take up, you're allowed to greedily take up as much position or space as you want while still, you know, adhering to all the constraints that have been placed on you. So definitely keep that in mind. It's match constraint. It is greedy again. So that's why it kind of works as a match parent, but it is not match parent. And I think further than that, don't even think about it as match parent, but think about it as almost a, I mean, this is really silly. I like to think of it as almost a magic word. Think of it as like Shazam, or when like the kids in Voltron make Voltron, they get access to like, you know, superpowers. It's kind of like that in constraint layout. Like if you kind of either kind of open up autocomplete on an item in constraint layout, or you go through the documentation, there's all these like attributes. And sometimes like either traditional Android attributes don't work, or those don't work the way you think they do. But really what needs to happen is a lot of those are tied into match constraint. Match constraint in a sense opens a view up to kind of more interesting kind of layouts specifications. So now say, you know, I have a director and, you know, I have a bunch of directors. Maybe one of them has a really eccentric name that's really long. And say that I wanted to kind of make this fit better. I wouldn't actually do this, but say for sake of argument that I wanted to set a max width. Oh, sorry, oh, do you need me to stop video or like supersize it? So say that I had a really eccentric director name, and say like I wanted to set a max width for some reason. I wouldn't actually do this, recommend doing this, but say I want to do that. If I use a traditional max width, it doesn't work. But what you do have in constraint layout is, and it's in the app space, is something called constraint max. Oops. Constraint is layout max width. And let's set it to something small just so that we can see what's going on. As you can see, it works with max width. It looks horrible. But again, there's a lot of attributes like this that are kind of activated, or that are kind of present when you set match constraints. Something that is a little more interesting and that I love is dimension ratio. Now say I have this kind of image here. If I set the height, for example, to match constraint, and then I use this dimension ratio attribute, I can actually specify kind of like a high level aspect ratio for this view. And so like I can make it square, I can make it kind of 2x3. And again, this is activated because I set the height to match constraint. So I wouldn't necessarily put this in the toolbox. It's a little bit specialized, but kind of, again, being aware that it's not match parent as 0DP, that's a tool, but the fact that you have this kind of special mode where you can kind of allow this constraint a lot of kind of specialized or kind of like not typical to Android layout abilities. So now, so I'm going to go ahead and go in my toolbox, and I'm going to get rid of match parent and say, okay, really what we have is 0dp and match constraint. Match constraint is kind of like the internal constant name for 0dp, but really it's just 0dp when you use it IRL. So something else that you may already know, but that I think is super important. And let me get rid of this silly director name because it's a bit extra silly. Something that, again, you should be aware of that absolutely goes into a box. It might be a little bit basic, but I think it absolutely belongs there, is baseline alignment. If you're not quite familiar, baseline is when you have text, it's that kind of imaginary line that the body of the text sits in, and that you might have extenders that sit below. And, I'm sure it says this in material design guidelines somewhere that you should be aligning things on the baseline. And it's actually really easy to do in constraint layout. So say I wanted to align this year to the director name by the baseline. What I can do is, rather than say trying to center it vertically to that view or something like that, I can do baseline. And then, oops, I want to do the director. Oops. And as you can see here, it actually kind of shows you, it might be hard to see since I'm a little bit small, the baseline of this text view and the baseline of that text view are aligned. And I think sometimes when you're putting tools in your layout toolbox, it's important to think of things or keep in mind things that will enable you to make layouts more like readable from a high level, and also more like stable and adaptable. And I think baseline does that because, for example, say for some reason you had a lot of padding on the director text view for some reason. If we had vertically centered this, like the year would be down here and the text would not be aligned anymore. But by using baseline, we're saying, hey, we're kind of in a more specific high level way saying how we want these two things to behave together. But we're going to take the padding out because it looks silly. So we're going to put that actually in the toolbox. So it's basic, but I think especially if you work in UI with a lot of text in it, or with kind of lots of different information on the screen, it makes a lot of sense. So the next tool I'm going to talk about is a little bit amorphous and a little bit silly to call a tool, but there's actually in the constraint layout documentation this concept of, I'm actually going to turn my camera off because it looks like it's lagging. Maybe that'll help. There's actually this concept of impossible constraints. Now, to show you what that means, I'm going to zoom in a little bit so y'all can see. So in the movie poster here, eek, a little closer. All right. So I have this movie poster and I have an icon on top of it. I'm an engineer, not a designer, so this is not something that looks good, but for the sake of demonstration, we can see that, okay, the icon is vertically and horizontally centered, which means that, here in my code, I have, the start of the icon to the start of the poster, the end of the icon, the end of the poster, and so on and so forth for top and bottom. Now, you can think of this as just how I vertically center or horizontally center something in constraint layout, and that's totally fine. But I think what the tool here, or what the specific thing that is kind of worth taking away from this and maybe might help you kind of grok or really make the most of constraint layout better, is the idea that these are actually, what the documentation referred to as impossible constraints. And the reason they call it impossible is that if you think about it, we're saying, okay, the start of the icon goes to the start of the poster, and the end of the icon goes to the end of the poster. But that's not actually possible because of discrepancy in the size. Now, constraint layout, when faced with this impossible constraint, doesn't say screw you and then just crashes or anything, right? It finds a kind of fairly internally consistent and reasonable way to deal with the consistency. And what it does is that, because of the discrepancy in size, there's extra space between the icon and the poster. And it basically just, evenly divvies that space up in the, in the front and the back of those constraints, which means that we get, center alignment. Now, again, this is not an attribute that specifically is center alignedness, in very explicit terms. But what we're doing here is leveraging this kind of ability of constraint layout to handle impossible constraints to get vertical and horizontal alignment. I think that might be, see, that's kind of, I think that kind of not explicitness with kind of like common concepts in layout might also make it difficult, but I think it's actually a boon. Like impossible constraints sounds like a bug, but it's actually very much a feature of constraint layout. And, you know, what's interesting is that you can actually, you know, take these impossible constraints, take how constraint layout handles them and leverage it. And it kind of has some built-in ways of doing that. And if you've kind of messed around with it a little bit, you know that there's a thing called bias, not a bad bias. This is an okay bias. And bias is basically how that extra space between the thing A and the thing B that you're constraining it to, how the discrepancy in space is distributed between like the front and back of that constraint. So if it's a horizontal and I set it to 0, then the icon gets shunted to the start. If I set it to 1, then it gets shunted to like all the way to the end, and similarly for top and bottom and 0 to 1. And that's like a really, you know, great ability to have. I'll be honest with you, I don't often use like horizontal or vertical bias with center constraints in this way. Like maybe you want a little bit of a relative offset if you're aligning visual elements or something. There is something I think personally is a little bit cooler that I like impossible constraints for, but I'm going to hold on to that for a second. But again, trying to like leverage the fact that constraint layout can handle these things, you can do some really cool stuff. So say I'm here to material design guidelines and I want to do something like, oh, I lost it. Here, where is it? So in material design, you know, with fabs and stuff, there's this notion of aligning the center of something to the edge of something else. And, you know, if I had to do this without constraint layout, I don't know how I could do it nicely. You know, I'd probably create a custom view group, or I do some really hacky thing with calculating padding and margins that was really brittle. But, you know, with the fact that constraint layout kind of has this interesting internal logic and is able to kind of handle quote unquote weird constraints, I can do something like this. Oh, whoops. Let me zoom back in so you can see, where I'm aligning both the top and bottom of the icon both to the bottom of the poster. And again, because constraint layout, instead of saying, screw you, I'm going to go home, tries to reconcile those discrepancy in an even way, I'm actually now center aligning this icon on this edge. So I've got that kind of cool fabby on the edge of a toolbar, you know, behavior. And I can do that with, again, just changing an attribute. And I think that's so interesting. And yeah, like, so this is a bit of an amorphous tool. It's not exactly a specific thing, but kind of being aware that it's not like, you know, a kind of like specific dance steps 1, 2, 3. This is how you center align things, but understanding that it's kind of like this interesting way that the engine, you know, that is rendering and laying things out works to see if you can do cool things with it. And 110% shout out to Mark Allison, Styling Android. This is like the first like cool trick I learned in constraint layout. It's still my favorite. So Mark is awesome, and that's just how it is. So I'm going to go back to biases, the good kind, not the bad kind. I am going to add impossible constraints just as a concept and kind of like an idea to keep in your head when you're working with constraint layout. And it might help you sometimes when things go wrong to understand like maybe that's something about the way the layout algorithm works. So say I have this, I called it fine print in the layout, but say, you know, you have something like this, and this is actually something I had to do in work, where I had some text and I had a badge, an icon that I wanted to hug, you know, the end of this content. So the way I've done it here is I wanted to align these two things and have like the eye hug the end of the text, but I also wanted to make sure that things didn't, you know, kind of go off screen. So what I tried to do was, oops, sorry, let me see. So I aligned, it doesn't seem to want to highlight and be close. Here we go. So I took the fine print and I aligned it to the parent with some margin. And I actually attached it to the eye and then attached the eye, sorry, to both the text and the parent so that I can kind of give it, you know, I'm gesticulating a lot, and I turned off my video and I realized it's kind of silly. I'm making all these hand gestures at y'all. So I basically put up guardrails, right? I say, okay, I want the eye to be no farther than the parent side. I want the text to be no farther than the start parent side, and then link them together. If you've been using constraint layout a bit, you might recognize this as a chain, but the problem is like right now, everything's centered. So what I use biases for about, I'd say 75% of the time is actually for left alignment. So if I just add a little bit of bias to the head of this chain, I can kind of set up my guardrail, set up my constraints the way I want them, and still position things the way I want. Now, why this is interesting is going to become a lot clearer in just a minute. But again, like, since you have to play around with these impossible constraints, I would definitely get super comfortable with adding both types of biases, horizontal and vertical, to your toolbox. But yeah, and so there's another like very specific thing that I absolutely want to talk about. And so in this case, this actually happened to me at work. So this looks great, right? My eye is aligned to my text. It's all left aligned. It looks great. But say I had something like some data that was super, super, super long. Okay, what the heck happened? I specifically, made this great chain and kind of anchored, my eye icon to the parent side, but it's getting shoved to all the way off screen. What's happening? Something, again, trying to understand how constraint layout works. Wrap content is like written in stone when you put it in constraint layout. If you set something to wrap content, it will be wrap content. It will be whatever width it needs to be to wrap content. And that kind of sucks, right? In this case, because I have some really long content. Well, okay, I really wanted to wrap content, but what if I did 0 DP, match constraint? All right, that looks a little better, right? So my eye is still kind of constrained. It's not running off the side. That looks good. But this doesn't actually really solve my problem all the way, because if I have short data in there again, well, again, match constraint is kind of greedy, so it's sucking up all the space. So what do? I want it to wrap content most of the time, but if it's going to be too big, then I do want it to kind of match constraint. Well, I can still have my cake and eat it too. Yeah, have my cake and eat it too. I can wrap content, and in the case where the data is super long and doesn't actually match constraint, I can use one of my favorite attributes ever, and that's constrained width. And if I set that to true, what this says is, okay, I'll give you wrap content, but you say you want the width to be constrained, which means that if at any point wrapping content violates the constraints, then we're just gonna say screw it. We're gonna match constraints over wrapping content. So this combination of the bias of the chain, the wrap content, and the constrained width has saved my bacon so many times when you want to do these things where you want something, again, to be adaptable and stable and responsive to different kinds of data, the different, like lengths and whatever that you have, and still kind of make things look the way you want. So those two things together, constrained width and constrained height, are, again, two of my favorite things. I'm going to actually add it to a different section of our toolbox. Flexibility and scalability. So definitely using those with wrap content will save your day. So in the theme of sometimes the data isn't your friend, let's take a look at this. So I have this weirdly scary fine print, and it's constrained to the bottom of this text, which is my synopsis text. And it looks just fine. The rest of the content is kind of anchored to this fine print, which is anchored to the bottom of the synopsis. Cool. All right, well, let's say that our synopsis might be something small. Oh, all right, now I'm already running into a problem. So because I constrained this fine print to the bottom of my synopsis, in the case where, say, other elements that might be adjacent to it are taller, I'm getting this clipping. Okay, well, what can we do about this? Well, the not answer, the not good answer would be to go down to fine print and align the bottom of it to my image, my still image here. Okay, that works, right? Oh, whoops. Oh, let's not break the layout. Okay, so that works, right? Not all the time. If I ended up having, oops, that's not what I want to do. If I ended up having, where are you, synopsis? A long synopsis again, it's really easy to see, well, that's just not, trying to guess which one is longest is not going to work. So another absolutely like essential tools in your toolbox is the barrier. So, this happens so often, especially if you work on an app which has a lot of user-generated content or content you cannot control or that is highly dynamic, is this kind of competition sometimes between visual elements of, okay, who's furthest along? And I think it was in 1.1, we got added the barrier. So I'm going to go ahead and add a barrier. Okay, so a barrier, it's technically a view. like that is what its subclass is, but really it's a helper. It just basically allows you to specify how something in the constraint layout should behave. So a barrier has two kind of important components. One is a direction and one is a group of IDs. So if I put in synopsis and still, so the barrier basically says, okay, for this group of views, whichever one sticks out the farthest in this direction, I'm going to use that view's, position in that direction as kind of like my position. And what you can do is actually constrain something like, this fine print to the barrier. And as the content changes, this barrier will move with it. And kind of along with that, so will any view that's constrained to it. So regardless of whether, I have a short synopsis or a long synopsis or a short image or a long image, that barrier will just kind of be in the place of the kind of farthest, sticking outest. I made that up. That's a good word. Sticking outiest, oh man, view. And, it allows, again, your view to be more flexible and adaptable. And it's really awesome. It came out at 1.1 and it took us a while on our team to adapt 1.1, but oh, dude, I just use it all the time. And I think it kind of exemplifies, one of those challenges that we have as Android developers is always trying to be aware of different device sizes, of different screen sizes and orientations, and making sure that things, are fluid and adaptable. Absolutely something that you should keep in your toolbox. Something similar, which, I think is definitely a good, another kind of view helper, like a virtual item in the constraint layout, is guidelines. So if I look at this layout, I have my poster view, which has a margin start at 48. I have, go down here, I got a margin start at 48 on my synopsis, on my still, everything has like margin start 48. And, this is not very maintainable, right? If I wanted to change, how far this margin is, here I'd have to go and edit every one. You kind of mitigate this a little bit by using a dimension, but it's still, there's better ways to do it, and ever since we've had like material design, we've had this concept of key lines, right, in grids. And what I really like is that guidelines in constraint layout play in very well with that. Now, certainly, again, you could use dimension resources, but I think a guideline, which again is another kind of view subclass, but doesn't actually get rendered, it's more just like a helper for other views to position themselves. I think it matches in really well with an idea of wanting to be like high level, wanting to kind of have your layout, in a sense, tell a story of what is going on. And guidelines play in very well to that. And so rather than having margin start everywhere, and having to update them, manually, or, resource is okay. But if I go ahead and just get rid of this, and then rather than constrain to the start of the parent, I constrain to the start keyline. Hold on, start keyline. What did I do wrong? Boop. Oh, wait, that was the wrong. It's constrain start to start of keyline. Huh. Oh, wait. Oh, it's a good time to have a bug when you're in the middle of a presentation. Huh. Okay. What did I do wrong? Generally, when it works, you should be able to constrain start to start keyline. Guideline begin. Okay, I don't know why that didn't work. Maybe I typed it wrong. But yeah, so rather than constraining, having a specific margin, I can go ahead and actually replace some of these things with the keyline. And so this brings a couple benefits, right? Again, it's more of a high level way of specifying how content should be laid out. If I change the position of the keyline, then anything that's aligned to it kind of goes with it. So it's kind of like a one-stop shop for changing your margins or your keylines rather. But I also like that it lives in the file. And again, it's kind of part of telling the story of the view and being kind of high level and being able to specify things, again, in a more readable kind of human like language kind of way. I know we're running short on time, but I'm going to try to zip through a few things. But yeah, guidelines will definitely go in the toolbox. And again, I kind of use these all over the place, especially since now as our team, for example, is trying to move more towards as much material design guidelines and kind of grid system as possible. I feel like it just kind of goes hand in hand with kind of design systems and things like that. So I just adore guidelines. So let's talk about coordinating multiple views. Now, I've definitely talked about chains like before when I've kind of given presentations on constraint layout, and I used to say things like, well, if you want linear layout in your constraint layout, you should chain. I'm going to retract that a little bit. So if you're not familiar, chains are, I think the most succinct way of thinking about them is that they are doubly linked lists of views within a constraint layout. And they're a way, again, of controlling, of grouping and controlling the behavior of a group of views. So if I go down here to my little knife icons here, they're in a chain. It's a horizontal chain. And every item in the chain is constrained both on the start and end side. The ones in the middle are constrained to like the view in front of it and the view behind it. And then the ones at the end are constrained to the parent. That's a chain. I think that chains are good, but I feel like the advice that they're like linear layouts is incorrect because I think I know I tended to overuse them because of this behavior. So if I just wanted to say, kind of line these icons up and just kind of left align them, I wouldn't use a chain these days. I would literally just say, okay, you go to the parent, you go to the first one, you go to the second one, and you go to the third one. I would just do a singly linked list, let's say. And I would only venture into chain world when you want to control not just the grouping and the layout of these, but also the space in between. I think that's something that's really interesting about chains, that you can control the space both kind of at the ends of the chain and in between. Or if you're using a pack chain, you can almost treat, this group of icons as almost like one. You can position them as almost like one item, where you can kind of shift them all the way to the left or all the way to the right. You could, if you wanted to do something really interesting, like have them in a chain, but then say have like a space, like a centered space, like in between, something like this, where they still behave and are grouped together, but you kind of can play around the spacing a little bit. I would use chains. I would not use chains unless you wanted something very specific like this, just because I think it's really easy to screw them up. I've definitely had many layouts where I screwed up a chain and couldn't tell, and then for some reason everything was just all over the place. But yeah, I would definitely use them, but again, very specifically. They still go in the toolbox, especially if you want to kind of do cool things with centering or aligning things, and again with the spacing. But I think the caveat here is that you don't have to use them if you want to align things vertically or horizontally. That being said, as I'm prepping my next and final demo, if you want to just have all of your views like aligned like in a linear layout and you don't need all this relative stuff, just use a linear layout. If you have a couple of views, like maybe an empty view state and like a recycler view, and you want to toggle between the two, depending on how your data comes in, use a frame layout. I think part of using constraint layout effectively is knowing when to use it, and that's not all the time. I know like constraint layout is now like the default layout when you open activity, but that doesn't mean you have to use it. And I feel bad because I feel like the gentlemen that write constraint layout or work on it, Nicola Roard and John Hofford, I feel like I've seen them like actually field this question so many times. Like, if it makes sense to use an OG like Android layout, use it. But if you need to align things linearly and you want to do it in the context of a constraint layout, there's a brand new tool in 4.1 that is called a flow, which is awesome, that you should keep in your pocket. I didn't actually, hold on, let me fix this. Now, I'm going to say this, and hopefully I'm not proved wrong by myself in a couple of years. You can think of flow as the Flexbox layout of constraint layout. What's really cool is that it will align views, and it basically takes a group of views and will align them in a direction, vertical or horizontal. And what's really cool is that it does wrapping. Now, instead of having that chain, I have a whole bunch more icons just to show you. And then I'm going to actually, where did those buttons go? I'm going to move this. Where did the buttons go? Okay. I'm actually going to align this to the bottom of the flow. Out of the way. So what's really cool is that I just have this, just a bunch of these icon views in the file in a line. There's actually no constraints on them because the constraints are all handled by this flow. Now this flow is again a virtual kind of helper, except this time rather than being like a guideline or a target, it's actually a virtual layout within constraint layout. And what's happening is that, I've added, and this might be a call to do it dynamically because this is a ridiculous attribute. But what I'm doing is giving Flow a group of icons, and it lays them out as if it was a linear layout, but it's constrained to the right side of this parent. So when it gets to the point where if it laid out another icon and it would be, kind of violating constraints, it wraps it. It makes it a little bit taller. It kind of wraps the icons around and continues laying them out. And I think that's just so cool. Like I wish I had this a few years ago when I was doing reactions, like we were doing Slack style reactions at my work. And I was trying to lay out, my little reaction bubbles, kind of Slack style, where they kind of, again, wrap like this. And I did a whole custom view group to do that. This can do it for you. And you can see it's super clean. It's just a single tag where you say, okay, like, wrap layout, these views. And again, you could probably do this dynamically to make it a little cleaner, and you get this behavior. And what's really cool is you can actually have different kind of styles of doing it. There's different wrap modes. Currently, this is called aligned, where it will actually take views and turn them into columns. So say these are all kind of like equal size, so it's a little hard to see. But if I change, like say the size of one of them, you can kind of see here that Flow rather is creating columns and aligning, corresponding items in the same column, like underneath each other. There's also kind of chain mode where it actually treats each line as a separate chain. And so, you can, rather than having it be like a grid, like a faux grid, you can do these kind of like multiple chains if you wanted to kind of them more centered or do interesting things. Again, 1.1, there's so much good stuff in 1.1. So if you haven't updated, you should. I mean, 2.0 is out. So if you're ready for that emotion layout, you should definitely update constraint layout, but flow. Oh, actually, sorry, chains and flows. So I'm going to say that, with these, like with this set of tools, I think these are all really good places to get started. I think these are things that will help you handle kind of tricky things, that will help you, kind of build super adaptable and flexible, and also I think easy to read layouts. And like, especially kind of like the more recent additions like Flow, like Barrier, are a really good starting place and absolutely belong in your toolbox. And I think that, if you can kind of get comfortable working with these, and again, kind of understand how constraint layout works, and kind of like the weird way it is able to let you do things like impossible constraints and like the super mode of match constraint. I think if you feel overwhelmed, try to just like dig into these things. And once you kind of get these down, maybe you can go out and use circular constraints or something really particular and specific. But if you can make it work, and I think you can do a lot with these tools, then you're doing constraint layout right. And that's my talk. I'm sorry I'm going for a bit over, but yeah, thank you all so much for listening to me.